In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, four children have newly arrived in the magical land of Narnia. Their new friends, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, are explaining the country and its dangers to them. Among them, the terrifying White Witch. The witch appears to be human and would like for people to believe that she is. The Beavers warn that she is only half human and therefore not to be trusted. As Mr. Beaver says, in general, take my advice. When you meet anything that's going to be human and isn't yet, or used to be human once and isn't now, or ought to be human and isn't, you keep your eyes on it and feel for your hatchet. While C.S. Lewis rejected many of Sigmund Freud's ideas, this passage from one of his children's novels provides a simple explanation of what Freud called the uncanny, an experience of literature that evokes our most private fears and longings. In his essay entitled The Uncanny, Freud undertakes to define this sensation and explain how stories create it. Freud begins by noting that this is a question of aesthetics or art. While the uncanny belongs to the category of horror or dread, the term refers to a very particular experience. As Freud explains, the uncanny is that class of the frightening, which leads back to what is known of old and long familiar. Freud uses the German terms Heimlich and Unheimlich. Heimlich means homely or belonging to the house. It would be tempting, Freud notes, to assume that unheimlich means something strange, but not everything unfamiliar is frightening, so some other element is needed. Freud then notes that one definition of Heimlich is something secretive, something belonging to the house, in that it is private or kept hidden. If you know anything about Freud's theory of the unconscious, you know that Freud was fascinated by the idea that there are parts of each individual's psyche that we keep hidden, even from ourselves. Freud called this repression, pushing fears or desires beneath the surface of our thoughts where we do not have to admit or confront them. If what is Heimlich is familiar or hidden, then the uncanny must have something to do with these hidden things being brought to the surface. Freud quotes another author, Schelling, who states, Unheimlich is the name for everything that ought to have remained secret and hidden, but has come to light. It is not hard to see how secrets revealed would be frightening. But what does this have to do with literature? And how can fiction evoke this uncanny feeling in the reader? Drawing upon the works of other authors, like Schelling and Ernst Jentsch, Freud argues that one of the most effective strategies for a writer creating the uncanny is to raise the reader's doubts about what is alive or what is human. As a genre, horror is replete with characters that are alive but shouldn't be, or which appear to be human when they are not. This explains why something as familiar and comforting as a doll can also be frightening in films. The doll is not human, but it has a human like appearance. It should be inanimate, but it is the nature of child's play to imagine that the doll is alive and doing human like things. Another way that the familiar can become uncanny is through the alteration of the human body itself through mutilation. All body horror would fall into this category, but especially the fear of missing limbs or losing eyes. Freud associates this imagery with the fear of castration. Another version of the human non human dichotomy in the uncanny is doubling. This is the evil twin or the alter ego. Dr. Jekyll drinks a potion and turns into Mr. Hyde. The mirror reflection can be an uncanny double, and so can one's shadow. A repeated motif or pattern that repeats itself from one generation to another is another type of doubling. For example, in the Netflix series Bodies, the same body turns up in the same place in four different historical eras. turning a murder mystery into a story of time travel. So, how do all these things fit together? How can a doll or a shadow that we turned into an imaginary childhood friend belong in the same category as horrors like zombies and mutilation? The connection lies in the nature of repression, those Heimlich or secret things that the uncanny brings to light. For Freud, the double or cherished doll is an extension of ourselves. Our childhood narcissism projects the self onto an inanimate thing. Underlying that is a fear of death. If we could project ourselves outside our own bodies, we could cheat death and survive. The zombie is also a figure of human survival beyond death. In other words, the Heimlich can hide our desires as well as our fears. The problem is that once they are out in the open, the desires can become our fears. The animate doll isn't loving, it's creepy. That image in the mirror might look like me, but if it were to begin acting on its own, it would no longer be me, but something else, something uncanny that would be familiar and strange all at once. At this point, it's worth exploring one other example of the uncanny that Freud could not have anticipated in 1919 when he wrote this essay. For Freud, the automaton, a moving machine that looks human, basically a primitive robot, was as sophisticated a technology as he could imagine. But consider this picture that I produced for another video using an AI generator. At first glance, AI generated images have the same quality as human produced art. But look closer. See any elements of the uncanny? Hopefully, you are remembering that missing limbs are one feature of the Unheimlich. Inverted noses, extra fingers, and missing limbs are just some of the giveaways that an artificial intelligence is attempting to recreate the human and not quite succeeding. In conjunction with AI, there is a contemporary idea called transhumanism, which believes in part that humanity can use technology to improve the human body and brain, perhaps even achieving immortality through integration with technology. Freud would have seen in this belief another version of doubling, projecting the self onto the inanimate in order to survive death. Science fiction has already begun to explore how the realization of this desire might result in the frighteningly uncanny. So, how can any of this help you understand and explain literature? Here are some things to help get you started. 1. Be able to explain the difference between the Heimlich and the Unheimlich in each story. What is it that should be familiar or homey, but which is being presented as strange or frightening? This could be the setting, a type of character, or even the protagonist encountering themselves in an alarming way. 2. Freud gives us a working list of uncanny things: dolls, mirrors, shadows, alter egos, evil twins, missing limbs, and artificial life, to name a few. We might add a few more. Freud observes that déjà vu, the feeling that you have been somewhere before even when you haven't, can be uncanny. Animals that behave in a way that is too knowing or too human can be uncanny. Like dolls, human like animals are a childhood fantasy that can be frightening when the fantasy becomes real. In science fiction, the alien might be a disconcerting version of that which looks human but isn't. Be sure to recognize and discuss these uncanny types when you see them in stories. 3. Use Freud as a starting point to push into an interpretation. Many of Freud's ideas have not held up to the scrutiny of modern scientific research, and no reader is obligated to agree with his literary opinions. But by tying the Heimlich to the hidden, and suggesting that the Unheimlich is our own fears and desires brought to life. Freud has given us an example of how to ask questions of the stories we read. What might the uncanny things in stories represent? Are they symbols? What exactly are we afraid of? What do these stories say about our needs or desires? Is there a moral lesson to be learned? Do the stories help to define our human limitations? Even if you have never had a fascination with the dark and weird, reading the uncanny can be a profitable experience. These stories invite us to consider dark and light aspects of our own humanity, and they invite us to consider how to live in a world where some things are beyond our understanding.